Lyle Shelton. And I met Lyle this evening, and I was determined to remember his name, as I obviously forgot his partner, the other candidate's name. But it's great that you took the opportunity to contact us, Lyle, and please, everyone, make Lyle welcome. Lyle standing for the Australian Conservative Party.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks very much, everyone, for the opportunity to be here tonight. It is a privilege. I think it's terrific that community groups like this put on forums and make an opportunity for candidates to come and be heard. I'd also like to acknowledge Joanna Lindgren, who is number 2 on the Australian Conservatives Senate ticket. Jo is a former senator herself with the LNP, but saw the light and came over to the Conservatives. Her great uncle was the famous Neville Bonner, the first Indigenous senator, first Indigenous member of Parliament anywhere in Australia, and a very distinguished Queenslander. So, yeah. And of course, Jo's parents, Gloria and John, are here tonight, and it's great to see you. They're our greatest fan club. I'm standing with the Australian Conservatives, as has been said. A little bit about my background. I grew up in Toowoomba, just up the road, regional Queensland. Went to university there, studied journalism, and worked for a number of years with Rural Press Limited, who have their headquarters, or had their Queensland headquarters here in Ormiston, and I believe they're still there. Fairfax Media, no, what are they now? I drove past they're all gone, are they? The building's still there, I noticed the other day when I drove past. I used to come down once a week as part of the production of one of our little papers, so that's my only real connection with the Redlands, apart from doing work experience down here when I was studying journalism. There was a little start-up newspaper called the Redlander, which didn't exist for very long, but a local businessman wanted to take on the local news, which I think was the Capalaba paper. I can't remember now, it was about 30 years ago. Didn't last very long, but a few of us work experience journalists helped get it off the ground. And I just remember at the time, koalas was a big issue that we were reporting on in those first issues, and obviously that's a big and important issue still here today. The Australian Conservatives was formed just over 2 years ago by Senator Cory Bernardi, a South Australian senator who had been with the Liberal Party for 10 years as a senator and had been a lifelong Liberal. And he, I guess over time, developed some frustration with the Liberal Party, felt it was drifting from its roots, from its Menzies and Howard era roots, and was drifting towards the left. And he would make an argument in the party room and try and encourage the party to be its true self, a party of limited government, of free enterprise, of standing up for the family, civil society, all of these values which the Liberal Party was once famous for, but was drifting towards larger government, bigger taxes, taking on some of the supposedly socially progressive views. And Cory found that it just became untenable, and in his words, he didn't leave the Liberal Party left him. So he started the Conservatives just over 2 years ago, and our aim as a party is not to try and form government. We can't do that. But we do want to try and have an influence on the centre-right of politics and bring it back to its true self. And our tactic, our strategy for that is to try and get senators elected into the Senate and to try and have an influence there. We believe, and I personally believe, that Australia suffers a truth deficit and a common sense deficit in Canberra. And I think we're facing 2 or 3 really major crises that aren't getting enough airplay at this election. I think the first revolves around our energy security as a country, and I know there might be some differing views in this room, and I'm very happy to take questions. But we've closed down 10 coal-fired power stations in the last 6 years under a Conservative government, and we've not replaced the baseload generating capacity. As a result of that, our electricity network in Australia has become unstable and unreliable, and I know there's some gold plating issues to do with poles and wires which have contributed to the cost of electricity, but fundamentally our electricity prices are being influenced by the fact that we no longer, that we've subsidised renewable energy, and it's been very expensive, and we now are in a situation where our prices have gone high for consumers and also for industry. Jobs are starting to go offshore, and of course the grid is starting to fail. And we saw that in Victoria just earlier this year, when on a 40-degree day in Melbourne, 200,000 houses lost power. Now, Victoria always gets days over 40 degrees in summer, that's normal. But in 2019, as a result of closing down the Hazelwood Power Station, one of the largest power stations in Australia in the Latrobe Valley, where there's 400 years supply of brown coal there, and not replacing that capacity, suddenly we've got a grid that's failing. And none of the parties have a policy to address the energy shortage that we have. I would love it if we could power our modern industrialised economy on solar and wind. If that could be done, if solar panels could be produced in a way that was environmentally friendly and that they could be disposed of in a way that didn't harm the environment, if they could provide base load power, similarly for windmills. Sadly, they can't, and where we see the proliferation of these in Europe, they are backed up by nuclear power or by coal or by Russian gas increasingly as Germany closes down its coal-fired power stations and then backs up its renewables with Russian gas and, of course, nuclear in France and Britain. But we haven't done any of that sort of work here in Australia. Pumped hydro may supply some of that. I think that the jury's still out on that. That's a very expensive project that is still some years away. But in the meantime, we're on a trajectory to close down another massive power station in the Hunter Valley called the Liddell coal-fired power station. And the New South Wales Minerals Council and others have said that if that power station closes down when it's scheduled to close down, that New South Wales will have to be importing power from Queensland and Victoria. I don't know what they're going to import from Victoria. But that's a crazy situation. We're a nation that is endowed with hundreds of years' supply of coal, some of the cleanest coal in the world, particularly here in Queensland. We have some of the world's richest resources of uranium. And if you're concerned about human-induced climate change or global warming through CO2 emissions as a result of burning coal, well then why wouldn't we switch to a zero-emissions nuclear power supply so that we could look after the planet, if that's what we wanted to do, and ensure that we continue to be able to have air conditioners, refrigeration, and all the modern amenity of the sort of lifestyles that we have come to expect, as well as the industry and the jobs for our children's future. So no party has a coherent strategy or a plan or a policy to ensure that Australia has a secure energy future. I think it's an existential problem for our nation, and it's not being talked about here. And I will say, I'll put my cards on the table, you've probably guessed it already by the way I've spoken. I'm not convinced that CO2 emissions are warming the planet. I've spoken to a number of experts. I've had the privilege of meeting Professor Peter Ridd, who was sacked from James Cook University for questioning so-called climate science and its effect on the reef. He certainly says the reef is not dying, it's not in danger of dying. Parts of it have died, and that's natural. There's natural cycles, but there's also been a terrific rejuvenation, and certainly the claims of Bob Brown and the Greens that half of the reef is already dead is a wildly exaggerated, overblown claim, and it's not borne out by science. And of course, Peter Ridd said this as a distinguished academic and was sacked and gagged and had to go all the way to the High Court of Australia to be exonerated just a couple of weeks ago. So there's a whole big debate around that, but our approach to this warming debate is obviously affecting our economy. It's causing our economy to decarbonise and therefore deindustrialise, and that's having an impact on households, it's having an impact on business. I think the other great crisis that we're facing as a nation is one of basic freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom of parents to determine what their children are taught at school. A reference was made earlier to gender fluid ideology. This has now come in like a flood in the wake of the same-sex marriage debate, the redefinition of marriage, de-gender marriage. Now, of course, the next tranche of political ambition from the rainbow political activists, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, that's the flag that they fly under, but they have a political agenda. They've de-gendered marriage. They're now wanting to put forward the theory and teach it to our children that your gender is just a social construct. What is between here doesn't determine your gender, it's what's up here. And that's literally what is said in the curriculum that's being used here in Queensland right here, right now. And the Education Minister, Grace has said, because we've had a debate about marriage equality, parents just have to suck up gender fluid teaching of their children. Very, very serious. And if you want to speak against that, well, because gender identity is a protected attribute in anti-discrimination law, you're in danger of being taken off to an anti-discrimination tribunal or some sort of human rights body. Today, an organisation which I know the director of, called Binary, Kirralie Smith, was putting out an advertisement that highlighted this gender fluid teaching in schools. And it was called Drag Queen Storytime. Now, this is something which the transgender movement globally is pushing for libraries and for schools to adopt, to try and make children feel comfortable with the idea that their gender might be fluid. And so this billboard had a quote from one of Bill Shorten's shadow ministers, Senator Louise Pratt, who said that drag queen story time for little kids is a wonderful idea. So this was the billboard that Kirralie Smith was going to put up on behalf of Binary. It was rejected by the Advertising Standards Board. Why? Because they thought that it would be in breach of anti-discrimination law that would be seen to be vilifying someone. Now, this is ridiculous because they were using the imagery of the actual drag queen storytime resources themselves and highlighting the words of a Labor shadow minister who may well be in government after May 18, and yet the advertisement was deemed inadmissible, not allowed, banned, and no public discussion is allowed. What have we come to as a nation, regardless of what you believe about whether gender is biological or whether it's something that is in your mind? Regardless of your view on that, why can't we discuss that in Australia? When did Australia become a place where we have a government tribunal that can, where you can be dragged off to some sort of kangaroo court because of your views on whether boys are boys and girls are girls? This is what's occurred in this nation in the wake of the redefinition of marriage. The other great freedom of speech issue, and there's many others that I could touch on, is 18C of the Federal Racial Discrimination Act. Now, none of us want to vilify people on the basis of race. Of course, that's unacceptable. But I don't think we should have a law that says if you insult or offend someone, which is what 18C says, that suddenly you can, again, be taken off to some sort of a kangaroo court and end up in a legal process. Often these legal processes don't always end up with someone getting fined or whatever, but people find themselves in a process that takes a long time to resolve. There's something hanging over their head because an activist can bring a complaint, and the process actually becomes the punishment. So our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion is very much under attack in this nation, and I think that is something that would be unthinkable to most of our forebears. Globally, I think the other great threat that we have on the global scene is what's happening in China. Now, I think we all want to be friends with China. The Chinese people are amazing, industrious, innovative people. And what has occurred there in my lifetime in the lifting out of poverty of billions of people is nothing short of incredible. But Xi Jinping, the president for life of China, is someone who is a self-declared Stalinist. Could you imagine any world leader today saying that they wanted to be a self-declared Nazi? I mean, Stalin killed more people than Hitler did. We have a very, very short memory about the atrocities of totalitarian communism in the Soviet era. In China, they still have Mao Zedong's photo up in Tiananmen Square. This is a man who killed 60 million of his own people, 60 million people, and yet he is venerated as some sort of hero of modern China. Xi Jinping's step back towards communism and Stalinism, to use his words, is very, very worrying. The militarisation of the South China Sea is worrying. What they're doing through Confucius Institutes in our universities to try and influence Chinese expats here in Australia and influence our nation. What they're doing with property purchases and water purchases is very concerning, and I think we need to watch this very, very carefully. These are some major challenges, our energy issues, our economy, our freedoms, and what's happening on the global stage with the rise of China are things that we as a nation and our federal government should be very, very focused on. So at the Conservatives, we realise that Bill Shorten or Scott Morrison are going to be the Prime Minister after May 18. Our pitch to the Australian people is you need third-party insurance in the Senate. We believe that a drift to the left has been occurring over time. It's captured much of the Liberal Party, who have succumbed to a lot of these policies, and they haven't had the will or the courage to stand up to a left-leaning agenda. The Labor Party has been completely captured by this, of course, and the Greens have been driving a lot of these things, whether it's extreme approach to the economy on climate policy, whether it's attacking freedom of religion and freedom of speech. This has been very much driven by a Green left agenda, and I know I might get some debate and pushback from that here tonight, and that's fine. In the minor party space, it is very contested. There will be 6 Senate seats available this election. There's 2 minor party seats, one held by Larissa Waters of the Greens, one held by Fraser Anning of a new party called the Conservative National Party, which has ripped off our name, and not happy about that. At the Conservatives, yes, we do lean to the centre-right. I think we lean more to the centre. We are what Sir Robert Menzies was, if you read his speeches, and I've read many of them. It's very much where we sit as a party. It's the body politic that has drifted to the left. And we're saying, no, it's time to come back to the centre. We're not a party of yellow billboards or red hair or angry agendas or conspiracy theories. We are a party that is of principles. We stand for free enterprise, for smaller government, for civil society, for the family, for our Judeo-Christian ethic. These are the things that have built Australia. These are the values and the principles that we believe can take Australia forward into the future. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the Greens got a foothold in the Senate. They got a couple of senators in. They now built their numbers to about 9. They've got 1 in the House of Representatives. And they have had an incredible influence. Without ever holding power, they have led the Liberal Party, a Conservative government, to close down coal-fired power stations. That's not Liberal policy, that is Greens policy, and the Liberals have done it. Vladimir Lenin had a saying called, people that would help his agenda that were useful idiots. I think there's been a lot of Conservative politicians that have been the useful idiots for the Green left agenda that have led to policies which have damaged our economy, that have damaged our energy supply, that have damaged our freedoms, and this has to be redressed, and we have to bring things back to the sensible centre. That's why our approach is to go for the Senate. We want to try and be that counterbalance there. We will fight the Greens, we'll fight their ideas, because ideas have consequences, and not enough politicians have had the will and the courage to take on the Greens. They are committed, but our people get cowed into fear by political correctness and toxic identity politics, and are too afraid to fight for the things that have made Australia great in the past, which I believe can make Australia great in the future again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lyle. Any questions here? Also, Deb?
How do you propose that dealing with nuclear waste seems to be a bit of a problem in a lot of places?
Sure.
Have you got some magic bullet for that one?
Yeah, I think dealing with nuclear waste is a piece of cake compared to dealing with trying to dispose of used solar panels and windmills. They are very environmentally degrading. I would love it if solar and wind could provide the baseload power that a modern industrialised economy needs. I mean, I would. I'm not against renewables. But with nuclear waste, yes, it can be safely stored. I mean, particularly a country like Australia. I mean, I've flown over Australia many times. There is, vast tracts of nothingness in this country, and there are safe places. We are geologically a stable country, so there are places where we can dispose of nuclear waste more safely than we can dispose of the waste from batteries or solar panels.
It's actually quite interesting to hear you here tonight, Lyle. It's actually more of a personal question than it is a political question. I know in your career you've been subjected to quite significant attacks, sometimes physical, violent, and it's that kind of thing. What are your feelings on that? What do you think is fueling that, and what do you think can be done about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been called a hater, a bigot, a homophobe, all of these things. Those things have really actually hurt and wounded me. I don't hate gay people or transgender people. I have a different view of public policy. I have a view which probably 90% of parents have about the biological reality of gender. And yet, what I see so often from, and I hate the terms left and right. I've used them tonight because they serve a purpose. But so much of the left, and even prominent people, media commentators, resort to using slurs and name calling instead of actually engaging your argument. Now, last night, Joe and I were at a forum in Cairns where Warren Inch was there. Now, Warren was one of my principal protagonists on the marriage issue, if you take that issue. And I had the opportunity to, in an unfiltered environment where we could go beyond the media sound bites to put my case about why I supported retaining the definition of marriage. Now, he couldn't rebut, he chose not to rebut anything that I said. In fact, I said that the Australian people were lied to in the debate. We were told that there were no consequences. This is just about love is love. If it was about that, I probably wouldn't have worried about it. But the consequences, of course, have been very profound for freedom of speech and freedom of religion and for parents' rights about whether their kids are now subject to radical LGBTIQ theories. So I'm very concerned about the tenor of the public discourse and those who I would see as political elites who use name-calling and slurs to shut us down. The Greens were regularly calling me and my organisation in the Parliament a hate group. Now I found, I don't hate anyone. But a few months after that sort of rhetoric was used, a same-sex marriage activist who obviously had some mental health issues hired a van from Canberra Airport, loaded it with 5 or 6 26-kilogram gas bottles, drove it to our office and detonated it and caused $100,000 worth of damage.
Can you repeat that, please? Seriously?
A same-sex marriage activist by the name of Jaden Dwong, after the Greens had been, and I don't know whether he was influenced by their rhetoric towards us, but in the public discourse we were being regularly called a hate group, bigots. It was said that there is no place in Australia for our point of view, and we said that children, wherever possible, should be allowed to have a mother and a father. So Jaden Dwong, in December 2016, hired a van from Canberra Airport, filled it with gas bottles, drove to my office at about 9 o'clock at night. Luckily, I was on holidays. Luckily, none of the staff were there, although 2 of my staff had been working there 2 nights previous. And he detonated it and blew out all the windows on the ground floor. One of the windows on the first floor, where my PA sat, caused $100,000 worth of damage to the building. The next day, the Australian Federal Police held a press conference and said there was no political, religious or ideological motivation for this attack.
Can you now repeat that last sentence? The Australian Federal Police...
The Australian Federal... Commander Mark Walters of the Australian Federal Police held a press conference the next day and said there was no political, religious or ideological motivation for that attack. Now, the name of the perpetrator was obviously suppressed. He survived it. He was trying to kill himself, but he survived. And he was placed in an induced coma and airlifted to Concord Hospital in Sydney. But before he went to hospital, the police held an interview with him for 5 minutes while he was in the emergency room, obviously under some distress. And he disclosed, we learnt this about 6 months later when some enterprising journalists got hold of the court transcripts, where he confessed that he hated the ACL, hated religions, didn't like our positions on various political issues. And yet, with that knowledge, they held a press conference and said there was no political, religious or ideological motivation for the attack. Now, I'm very upset about that.
Do you consider that the Australian Federal Police downplaying it as to not cause public discord?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So was that
they had that knowledge.
Yeah. Was it a tactical response to keep a lid on it so as not to stir rhetoric, or was it just them, shall I say, for want of a better term, adhering to Masters' values?
Look, it's not for me to impute motives to the Federal Police, but what we now know as a result of what came out in the court case 6 months later, and when we got the name of the person, it was very clear. A quick Google search demonstrated this person had a history of political activism. Now that's fine, everyone's allowed to be a political activist, but to say that there was no political, religious or ideological motivation, to me, I'm deeply distressed about that, and I think the game of mates, theme might play out potentially, but I don't know. Some senators took it up. Anyway, I'm probably taking too much time with this, but I'm deeply all that to say, yes, I am upset. It did upset me. It upset my staff. And then a couple of months later, after our office was bombed, a prominent same-sex marriage activist by the name of Michael Barnett tweeted my home address publicly, and so I had to. My board installed video surveillance at my home and an alarm system. Now, you know, my kids and my wife live there, and I rang the police and said, look, not only have you downplayed what happened with this bombing, now, after the bombing, a prominent gay marriage activist has put my home address on the internet.
So
And they
you
said,
would-
oh, we'll drive a patrol car past your house every now and then. Well, thanks a lot, guys. You know.
I'll leave that to you to follow up. Is there any other question? There's one up here.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask what your thoughts are on such environmental issues as Adani or Toondah Harbour.
Yeah, I've only learned about Toondah Harbour tonight. Look, you know, I spent 6.5 years as a councillor on the Toowoomba City Council, so I'm well aware of the pressures of development and the dynamics that go around property development and local government. And whilst I'm someone who is pro-business, I'm not pro-development at any cost, and you know, you have to assess development applications on their merit, and you've got to look at the environmental constraints. So the little I've heard tonight concerns me, but so I don't want to say too much more than that. But you know, I was very intrigued with Cameron's presentation earlier, and I would just say I think part of the reason why people don't trust politics anymore, and at a local level, why there's so much, you know, called corruption, that's probably too strong. Well, it happens. We're a very apathetic people, and we do actually have the democratic systems and processes in place. I can understand why Cameron's putting forward all these innovative ideas, but I think if we just engaged the tools of democracy that we already have, and I think too many of us don't, we could address a lot of those concerns. With Adani, look, I'm a supporter of the Adani coal mine. I'd like to see the Galilee Basin open up. There is literally hundreds of years' supply of coal there. I love the idea that that coal, and I'm not saying Adani is a perfect company. India is a very corrupt place. This is not a perfect world. But the idea that poor people in India can get access to cheap baseload electricity is a good thing. We've seen the economic miracle in China. I want to see people in India come out of poverty. I also want to make sure that Australia keeps some strategic reserves of coal and uranium and any other resources we have now. I think at the moment, from what experts tell me, we've got abundant supplies, and yes, we can afford to export some, and I know the regions up there in Central and North Queensland, they would love to have those jobs. Joe and I have been up there, we've been running a campaign in North Queensland. You know, we support the opening up of those jobs and those industries, but I think long term we do need to look at strategic reserves, and I think we do need to look at coal-fired power for Australia. They're building heaps of these low emissions power stations in Japan and China as we speak, and yet we, in the country that has the most coal on the planet almost, have two major parties with policies of no more new coal-fired power stations. We are doing more to hurt our economy in the name of climate change than any other country on the planet, and our emissions are 1.4% of global emissions. If we shut our economy down tomorrow, we would have zero impact on the climate, according to our chief scientist.
Thank you.